And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Tuesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be covering a lot of topics in the next 2 hours. First of all, I want to get into some of the issues in the news. At the bottom of the hour, then we'll bring back our good friend George Barna, in which he has some new findings of the American Worldview Inventory and the tendency for Christians to sort of make up their view of Christianity as they go along. It sort of ends up being a cafeteria type of religion, or syncretistic was the word we used last time he was with us. We'll get into a more detail of that later this hour. And then in the next hour, we're going to spend some time once again equipping you. Mark Clark has a book called The Problem of Jesus, Answering the Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus, and that will be more clear why he refers to that word scandal, which actually is modified from one of the Greek words we find in the New Testament, but most importantly helps you answer questions, first of all, that you might have with your friends, neighbors, co-workers, maybe even family members that are skeptical, and then a whole section of material that will help you grow as a Christian, so I think you will appreciate that. My first article here is one we just added to the website because I was going to postpone it for a day or two, but you know what? It's in the news in some places, and it will be harshly attacked in others. So once again, trying to teach you a little bit of discernment, I want to get into that. And it has to do with a piece that came out by Nicholas Wade. Now, you might say, well, who is he? He has been the science writer for the New York Times for 40 years. Cambridge educated, very credentialed individual, who wrote a piece that I guess actually first appeared in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, but the one that most people are quoting is the one that appeared in Medium, and we have posted that. It's the last article we've posted on the website, The Origin of COVID Following the Clues. Now, the reason I decided I better bring it up today is because last night Tucker Carlson quoted from it and talked about some of the issues. It was something some of us were aware of because James Freeman, writing for the Wall Street Journal, talked about this when the article first came out. But you know what's going to happen because Tucker Carlson did it. They're going to say, well, it's just a conspiracy theory. Don't even pay any attention. And I'm not going to even take you to what Tucker Carlson said last night, although I think most of it was pretty accurate. I'm going to take you to the original article because that is going to be really hard to set aside. First of all, because Nicholas Wade, as many people have documented, is a science writer, editor, and author who has worked for Nature magazine, Science magazine, and for 40 years for New York Times. Okay, pretty good credentials. If that's not enough, very interesting tweet came out the other day from David Baltimore. Okay, who's David Baltimore? David Baltimore, I actually crossed paths with him. My wife worked in the genetics lab at Yale University as a secretary. Frank Riddle was the professor there, but David Baltimore was in and out. He had been at MIT, and then he was at, I think it was Rockefeller University. He had kind of a leave of absence. By the way, when he was there, he'd won the Nobel Prize. In 1975, won the Nobel Prize at the age of 37. Can you believe that? You know, a brilliant man indeed. And lest you think, well, he didn't do anything after that. Oh, no, he was, I think, the 6th president of the California Institute for Technology, Caltech. Anyway, David Baltimore the other day on a tweet of all things said, you know, the first time I saw this cleavage site in the viral sequence with the arginine codons, I said to my wife, it was the smoking gun for the origin of the virus. These features make a powerful challenge to the idea of a natural origin for SARS-2. Okay, let me break that down. There have always been two theories about how we ended up with this pandemic. And now, quoting from Nicholas Wade, and you can read this article in its entirety because we posted it on the website, he said, one of the theories is that the virus jumped naturally from wildlife to people. The other is the virus was under study in a lab from which it escaped. It matters a great deal which is the case if we hope to prevent a second such occurrence. And so, if nothing else, he now sets forth all sorts of evidence that indeed this did come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There was every reason to believe that, if for no other reason than the kind of things that you would expect from something that was a genetically modified virus. And so as a result, goes on to even simply talk about the fact that when you look at this, there was some suggestion that indeed what was being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was an attempt to do what is called gain of function. That is to see how you could make coronaviruses infect human cells. And so as a result, there is a pretty good evidence that that is indeed the case. To make this even more politically interesting, the research that was done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was funded by, are you ready for this? Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Now, you might say, now, wait a minute, this has always been pretty much dismissed as nothing more than a conspiracy theory. Okay, I understand that. The bottom line is a lot of this has to do with some of the various kinds of letters that were put out at the time to try to argue that this was nothing more than indeed a natural occurrence. You have, for example, more than a year ago, this is back in February, a letter that came out that actually argued that this was just naturally occurring, and that letter appeared in Lancet, which is a very prestigious journal in Britain. Well, the letter was organized and drafted by Peter Daszak, who is the president of the EcoHealth Alliance. But more importantly, in many points that have been pointed out, if this virus had escaped from the research that he funded, then he would be what? Potentially culpable. So you start beginning to go back and look at some of the statements being made and who made the statements and the arguments being given. You begin to realize that there may be a lot more there. And if nothing else, I wanted to cover some of this today simply because because Tucker Carlson talked about it last night, have anybody talking about this, I'll say, oh, it's just a typical, Tucker Carlson conspiracy theory or Fox News conspiracy theory. No, this goes back to the article written by Nicholas Wade, who is a very prestigious individual, and it is also being followed up with all sorts of political actions. Mike Gallagher is a representative from Wisconsin, already has written a letter to Dr. Anthony Fauci, wanting to get some answers, in which he says the State Department has detailed several concerning revelations, including the U.S. government has reason to believe that several researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology became sick in autumn of 2019 with symptoms consistent with COVID-19. How much U.S. government funding has gone into the Wuhan Institute of Virology over time? How much of that has been supporting gain-of-function research? Did the government funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, even during the 2014 to 2017 moratorium on funding gain-of-function research? So this is a story that, as they like to say in journalism, has some legs, and it also might tend to be a little more embarrassing for some of the people at the National Institute of Health, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. That would be somebody like Dr. Anthony Fauci. Anyway, we're going to take a break, and if nothing else, I want you to read the article. There's a lot there, and we've just given you a brief summary. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Whether you are a Christian or not, you are benefiting from the positive impact of Christianity on your life. That's the premise of the book by Dr. Rodney Stark, America's Blessings, How Religion Benefits Everyone, Including Atheists. His book is a perfect response to atheistic professors who criticize America and the Christian foundation of this country. This book is a natural one for the professor to write since he has talked about the positive contribution of Christianity to Western civilization. Since we live in a country that Stark believes is unusually religious, we shouldn't be surprised that many of the blessings that Christianity has brought to the world can be found in America. He says people who attend church tend to donate more than others. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the research by Arthur Brooks that found the same things. Rodney Stark says that religious people dominate the ranks of blood donors, to whom even some angry humanists owe their lives. Christians also are far more likely to contribute even to secular charities, to volunteer their times for socially beneficial programs, and to be active in civic affairs. Religious Americans also enjoy better physical health. They have an average life expectancy more than 7 years longer than those of the irreligious. In fact, much of the difference remains even after the effects of clean living are removed. Rodney Stark also talks about another topic we've discussed in previous commentaries, the fertility gap. The fertility rate for religious people is much higher than for secular people. He cites Eric Kaufman's book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? That book points out that when you look at Europe, the population is declining, except in the religious sector. Despite what you might hear from atheists and skeptics, Christianity has been a blessing to America and the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, let me cover a couple of other things in the news that you need to know about, some of which you probably have heard about, others which maybe would be news to you, and that's certainly what we want to do. In a couple of cases, we're going to be talking about things you have been hearing about, the rocket attacks and the violent riots right now in Jerusalem and Israel, so you have heard a little bit about that, but I want to give you some context and some background. Maybe you've heard a little bit of the shutdown of the Colonial Pipeline. That was due to a group called the Dark Side, not to be confused with the Dark Side in Star Wars. And the Havana Syndrome, if you've heard about that, you really are a news junkie. So we'll get into all of that. But before we do, the first article I've posted is by Jenny Beth Martin. And I think it's a very good piece because it says, on this push towards election reform, in quotes, in other words, Senate Bill 1, which is also H.R. 1, the attempt is so-called For the People Act. A lot of people are derisively calling it the Corrupt Politicians Act, but whatever you want to call it, today in the United States Senate, the Rules and Administration Committee are doing what's called a markup. This provides the opportunity to provide any amendments and then to take it to the floor of the Senate. Now, again, you probably are very familiar with this because if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you certainly can click on the button that says Take Action. The current one has to do with the Equality Act, but if you hit the button that says Take Action, you'll see the second one listed there is the For the People Act moves to the Senate. Well, it is indeed in the Senate, and now it is being marked up, as they call it, for the Rules and Administration. Now, the goal, I think, especially by the person that is the head of the committee, that would be Amy Klobuchar, Senator Klobuchar, is to try to provide some amendments because there has been so much criticism of Senate Bill 1 or House Resolution 1. They're the same bill, essentially. But given the fact that this particular committee has a 9-9 tie, it is unlikely to get a majority to vote for any of those amendments. First of all, I'm not sure any Republicans are going to vote for the amendments because they're convinced that the bill is bad to the bone and doesn't need to actually try to dress up the pig with some lipstick, if you understand my idea there. So certainly there is going to be some attempts to offer amendments. I think they'll all go down in flames. And at that point, then the bill can continue on and eventually may be voted on in the United States Senate. The reason I bring this article up is it's a perfect way to illustrate a point that we have made on more than one occasion. If you go down to the essentially fourth paragraph, Jenny Beth Martin says the bill overturns state-level voter identification requirements. Right now, in 36 different states, you have some form of voter identification. All of those would be overturned by H.R. 1. Now, it's, of course, in the Senate, so it's called Senate Bill 1. And yet, if you look at the Rasmussen poll from March, that one showed that 75% of likely voters believe voters should be required to show photo identification, such as a driver's license, before being allowed to vote. I've seen some others that are even higher than that. And so you can very quickly see one that I looked at had 77% and had a very significant number of independents as well as Democrats and, of course, lots of Republicans that support that. But in this particular article, if you go down to about the sixth paragraph, you will see that in the Rasmussen survey, where you had 75% of likely U.S. voters say, no, we have no problem with voter ID. We think it's a good idea. 60% of likely Democrat voters agreed with that. 69% of African-American voters and 82% of other minority voters would agree with that. So you have this, if you will, break between the leadership of the Democratic Party and the basic grassroots of the Democratic Party who don't agree with that. Now, that's not the first time we've identified those kinds of segments and very remarkable discontinuities, but nevertheless, it's just something, again, that we should mention as a key issue and an illustration that oftentimes there are times when we're not served well by our leaders. Republicans have certainly said that. Certain African Americans have said about some of their African American leaders. And this is a classic illustration of where the Democratic leadership is trying to push forward a particular piece of legislation that is disagreed with by, in the case of just even Democrat voters, 60%, 6 out of every 10. And, of course, that has to do, of course, just with the whole idea of voter ID. There's all sorts of other issues, but I'm just using that to actually pull out of the whole bill just one obvious discontinuity that exists there. Okay, let's focus a little attention on what is happening in Jerusalem and in the Middle East. We will have Jim Dennison with us on Thursday, but he does take some time to point out in his daily article today that indeed the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said a struggle is now raging over the heart of Jerusalem because we've had riots in the old city of Jerusalem. We have had riots in the Temple Mount. And, of course, Hamas is in the process right now of trying to have a new intifada or uprising and have fired a barrage of rockets into Israel. You know, we had planned a trip to Israel in the fall. It's been a little bit on hold because of COVID testing and everything else. But I do think it's going to be a little harder to get people excited about going to Jerusalem in light of what's unfolded. How did this happen? Well, first of all, you've had right now in Jerusalem a national holiday, and it is called Jerusalem Day, and it's a holiday commemorating the reunification of Jerusalem and the establishment of Israeli control over the Old City after the 1967 Six-Day War. And so that was celebrated with the prayer services at the Western Wall that began Sunday night. But it also coincided with the Muslim celebration, Laylat al-Qadr. I may have mispronounced it slightly, but that's the way most of, I think, people have pronounced it. What's called the Night of Power, basically commemorating the night when the first verse of the Quran supposedly was revealed to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. And so you have these conflicts that have taken place on the Temple Mount, Western Wall, Old City, And while that's been taking place, you have the Palestinian militant group Hamas, which has been ruling Gaza, now calling for this new intifada and has been firing a barrage of rockets into Israel. And of course, Israel has responded with airstrikes, and you've had a lot of back and forth with a lot of apologists for the Palestinians and also those who defended Israel back and forth. So we will talk a little bit more about that with Jim Dennison on Thursday. I've been thinking about maybe even having Gary Bauer join us sometime in the future just for some of his perspective. But just before we take a break, let me give you two other stories. One, you may have heard about this pipeline that was shut down because of a cyber attack. This was done by a group called DarkSide. It's a group of hackers that often do what's called ransomware. And in some cases, they have taken nearly 100 gigabytes of data out of the network. But not only do they take data, but then they actually encrypt it, and it's ransomware. Unless you pay us, we will not allow you to use your computers. And in this particular case, they may find some other ways to route the pipeline. But any of you in Georgia know that this network is based in Alpharetta, Georgia. And it's a good reminder of, indeed, these cyber attacks that can affect our energy structures. And once again, we'll be following that story over the next couple of days. Finally, if you did not need any evidence of evilness out there in the world, there is a real problem with what many are calling the Havana syndrome. That came a number of years ago, where diplomats and CIA officers in Havana, Cuba, were actually being directed by various direct energy attacks. They were firing beams into the consulates, into the embassies, and as a result, people end up with severe vertigo, fatigue, headaches, sometimes loss of hearing, loss of memory, loss of balance. And Washington has had to actually remove as many people as they can from some of these different embassies. And so this has happened to not only Americans in places like Cuba, but Canadians as well. And it's now starting to be used in other places around the world. We now have injured CIA and embassy officers and diplomats in Cuba, in China, and in Russia. These are our enemies, and we would be wise if we understood that these are evil people doing what they can to physically harm Americans in those embassies and in those consulates. And so we should be aware. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with our good friend George Barna. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Again, we have George Barna with us, and we have spent a fair amount of time over the last couple of months and getting him on about every other week to take apart some of the great material and to highlight various parts of the material in this very significant American worldview inventory. And if you were with us 2 weeks ago, you might remember that we talked about this word syncretism. I think we'll start with that, but then we want to get into one aspect of that, and that is what is called moralistic therapeutic deism, something we've talked about before, even back in the old days when we were talking with Christian Smith and others, his book Soul Searching and others were using that as a way to pretty much describe what a lot of Christian teens were holding to. But as we have pointed out before, sometimes these worldview ideas don't stay in one person's head or one particular demographic group's mindset. They get spread elsewhere. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. George Barna, as you well know, is a professor at Arizona Christian University, president of the Cultural Research Center. Of course, in the past was the founder of Barna Group and an author of so many books, and an individual that's been a pastor and brings just so much to the table. So George Barna, welcome back.
Hey, Kerby, good to be with you again.
Let's get the syncretism on the table for just a minute, because syncretism isn't really a worldview. It's a, if you will, a hodgepodge or a cafeteria of worldviews. It's kind of a customized philosophy of life, but that's the foundation from which we're then going to get into this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism.
Yeah, it is. And the reason why knowing about syncretism is important is because as we try to look at how many people have each of the different worldviews that are out there, what we found is that very few people have a standard worldview, if you will. Basically, what they're doing is they're cutting and pasting elements from all these different worldviews into their own personalized worldview. That's what syncretism is. And that represents 88% of all adults in the country, including a majority of people who consider themselves to be Christian.
So again, when we are talking about this particular survey, the American Worldview Inventory Survey, and by the way, if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read all of that, we have a link, as we always do. You click on the picture there of George Barna. It will take you to arizonachristian.edu/Culture Research Center, but you don't have to know all that because we've got all the links there as well. And we also posted one on Christianity in America, so you'll have all sorts of things that you can look at later. But when you talk about these different worldviews, you know, it could be secular humanism, postmodernism, Marxism, for example, Eastern mysticism. But this one that we're going to focus on now is one that has been developed by sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Denton, in which they were really, at the time, to be fair, describing kind of a Christian teen culture that you would find sometimes when you would go to a particular church, talk to a youth group. You'd have these kids that seem kind of Christian on the outside, but if you just ask even a couple of penetrating questions, you recognize they really did not hold to Orthodox Christianity.
Well, it's true, and the reason why it's not terribly shocking that we see moralistic therapeutic deism becoming a more widespread worldview, or at least one that's influencing people's worldviews to a great extent, is that we have to remember that a worldview develops when somebody is young. So these were ideas that these people picked up probably before their teen years. And it was during their teen years that, you know, it was recognized by sociologists through the research. But those thoughts, those ideas and perspectives had been planted in the minds and hearts of these children when they were younger. And then they just take them with them through the rest of their life. That's how worldview works. It develops young. We embrace it. We figure out how to polish it up a bit, maybe refine it, figure out how to communicate it to others, because we always like other people to believe the same things and to do the same things that we do. Makes us feel like we got it right. And so that's what's happened now with MTD. It's gone from something that was germane just to young people to being something that now 50-year-olds across the country are being influenced by.
Let me just encourage some of you that might have something to write with. We just mentioned MTD, and that stands for Moralistic Therapeutic Deism. And you might say, why do they call it that? Well, moralistic, and again, George, you can help me if I make a mistake here, but moralistic is, well, we're supposed to, be moral people and be good to other people, so we need to be moral. Therapeutic is, well, God wants me happy, and the universal purpose in life and the real goal in life is to be happy and feel good about yourself. And then deism, I think that makes sense to most people, is kind of the belief that, well, we sort of have a belief in a watchmaker God. He started the watch and then walked away. In other words, he's distant from us. So God wants me to be good, but he's not involved in the day-to-day aspects of my life. And I'm supposed to be good and I'm supposed to be happy. Is that a kind of a summary, if you will, of this idea of MTD?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to get it across. There are a couple other things that supply some of the glue that holds those joints together, things like believing that there are no absolute moral truths. And why would that be important in this perspective? Well, because you want to be happy. You don't want to be limited in the choices that you make. You want to feel good about yourself. You don't want these kind of boundaries that are telling you, if you go past this boundary, that's a bad thing. So again, one of the key things about this perspective is that it puts the focus on us rather than on God.
And again, another one of those in terms of absolutes is what we might say pluralism. I don't want to use too many big words, syncretism, now pluralism, but it's the idea that if nothing else, there are different ways that people can be saved. In other words, good people go into heaven, and it really doesn't matter if you're a Mormon, a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist. Frankly, if you're just a moral person and you're an atheist and one of the unaffiliateds, oftentimes called the nuns, everybody's going to heaven. And isn't that also one of the things that kind of pull out of this idea of MTD?
Yeah, it sure is. Along with the idea that, yes, God exists, but he's not involved in your life. You can call on him in an emergency, and, he may show up and take care of the situation. But God's not interested in what you do from moment to moment. He's not placing demands on you, and that's one of the reasons why, for instance, from this perspective, the Bible isn't taken very seriously, because that has so many commands and principles and ways of living that are prescribed in there. And when you have this particular point of view, you think, nah, God wouldn't really do that. He just wants me to be happy, so I'll make the choices that make me happy, and that'll make him happy.
If we can maybe pull out a few of the other things from your survey, because this American Worldview Inventory, for example, you found that these are individuals that do not believe that people are sinful and need salvation through Jesus Christ. So I've already alluded to that a little bit in terms of this idea of pluralism, but speak to that for just a minute, because as we're talking about the problems, there are obvious solutions, and you've been a pastor at 2 different churches. Certainly parents, pastors, Sunday school teachers, leaders need to begin to say, if indeed this is kind of the worldview of people in my congregation, in my Sunday school class, then it seems to me that the first point is we better come back to this idea that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Kerby, because we're dealing here with a group of people that doesn't like to focus on the negative. They like to focus on the positive. And so they're looking for things in life that will make them feel good, that will make them feel comfortable, that will enable them to feel like they belong to a community of like-minded people. And when somebody brings up something like sin, implying, of course, that, yes, there is right and wrong, and yes, you can do things that offend God, and yes, if you don't get right with God, you're not going to go to heaven. That's, for some of them, a shock. That's, for some of them, repulsive. They would think, well, that's not the Christianity that I believe in. And so at that point, we have the opportunity to discuss what real biblical Christianity is, not the, paper-thin version that our society buys into, where we've genericized Christian faith so much that it doesn't really look anything like you would find in the Bible. But it does make people feel happy. But that's not God's objective. I mean, his objective is for us to achieve joy. And that joy, as opposed to mere happiness, comes from the relationship with him, comes from living the way that he's prescribed for us, because he knows that that's what will enable us to thrive. That's why he gave us the Bible, is so that we could thrive. But, I mean, these are some hard conversations to have with these folks, because it blows their bubble about them being in control of their life,
yes,
about them knowing everything that's going to lead to happiness.
Let me just mention, we've been talking about these false views about God or about your Christian life. After the break, we're going to talk about false views of the Bible. Matter of fact, next hour, we're going to be talking with Mark Clark. One of his chapters is The Problem of the Gospels. Can we trust the Gospels and all the rest? And you will find out when we come back from the break that we have a very high percentage of individuals that, first of all, do not believe the Bible is true and reliable. And number two, actually don't even necessarily always use the Bible for moral guidance. So we'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with George Barna. And again, if you find yourself saying, I'd like to look at some of those facts and figures and some of that information, we've posted that on the website. Of course, we have a link to the Cultural Research Center. So simply go to pointofview.net. And again, we're talking at the moment about moralistic therapeutic deism, or MT. STD. And George, we were talking about kind of the false view of God, or even the false view of what it means to be a Christian. But I wanted to hone in on two others, because in this survey, for example, you found that people that fit into this category, which, as you said, it may be America's most popular worldview, moralistic therapeutic deism, tend to trust sources other than the Bible for moral guidance. Now, the bottom line is certainly there's a value sometimes in helping other people, maybe look at your life. There's a wisdom in many counselors. Certainly we can gain tremendous amount of insight from godly men and women who've written other books and resources. But that's not the issue. Here, they tend to be just as trusting, maybe even sometimes more trusting of other sources than the Bible. And that's going to get you in all sorts of trouble, isn't it?
Well, it's absolutely the case. In fact, when we looked at what are those other sources that they trust, tops on the list are their feelings.
Yes.
And we know that emotions can lead us astray all the time, and they do. I mean, there's ample evidence of that in every person's life. And yet, this is a group that says, I'm in control. I've got to make the decisions. I know what's best and right for me. And the thing that I always can trust are my emotions. It's not true, but that's the thinking that goes on here.
And again, one of the others, and if nothing else, it's a perfect lead-in to our conversation next hour, because Mark Clark's going to take us through, do we know Jesus existed? Do we know enough about him? Do we know anything about the gospel? Can we trust the Bible as a reliable historical source first, and then as a reliable communication from God? And if I'm reading the survey correctly, it looks like 71% in one way or another do not believe that the Bible is the true and reliable communication from God. And that's going to get you in all sorts of trouble if indeed you're trying to even find a path for your future, because I think God knows a lot more about where we need to go than we do sometimes.
Yeah, true story. When we look at the people who buy into moralistic therapeutic deism, we find that just what you said, more than 7 out of 10 don't believe that the Bible is true and reliable. And related to that, they don't believe that God himself is the basis of all truth, 75%. And then you look at some of the things that are in the scriptures, and we find that enormous numbers of these people don't believe various stories that are told to us for our own growth that are in the Bible, things like the creation story. Most of them don't believe that. Most of them don't believe other things that the Bible teaches us, like about the Holy Spirit. They don't believe that the Holy Spirit exists. They would say that the Holy Spirit is just a symbol of God's power or presence or purity. And of course, as I mentioned before, they don't believe in absolute moral truth, and that the Bible is the document that provides us with the wisdom about how to know what that truth is. So you put it all together, and basically they've shut the Bible and shoved it aside and said, I'm going to look inward. I'm going to base things on my own experiences and emotions, and that's going to guide me well.
And again, to make the point is that in the past you've done various kinds of questions, like 6 questions, just asking what they think about God and Jesus and what they think about Satan, absolute values, a variety of other things. And you find very quickly that on one or more of those become kind of watershed issues that people are on the wrong side. But in the past, it always seemed like they got a few things right and they got a few things wrong. Now, if I look at this moralistic therapeutic deism, it's like they're wrong on almost all of those key questions that you used to use to identify whether an individual had a biblical worldview.
Yeah, and remember that when we're talking about people who are heavily influenced by moralistic therapeutic deism, 3 out of 4 of them consider themselves to be Christian.
Yes.
Most of them, the vast majority of them, have had extensive experience in churches. Almost all of them own a Bible. So it's not like they've had no experience and no exposure to Christian truth. What's going on here is that they're making a conscious decision that they're going to reject all of that in favor of these other perspectives. And, of course, in the report, I also show that, and that therefore influences their behavior, because that's one of the most important things about a worldview, as you know, Kerby, is that it's not just a bunch of disconnected ideas. It's the concepts that drive your behavior. And so we find that people who buy into MTV also are, engaging in premarital sex. They're facilitating abortions when, the potential birth is uncomfortable for their lifestyle. All of these things and more, that this kind of point of view is something that facilitates. So that's why this is important. We're not just doing an academic exercise here. We're trying to figure out, if we want people to have the life that God intends them to have, they've got to have the right perspectives, because that drives their lifestyle. And when they've got this kind of point of view, there's no way they're going to get there.
Well, let's, if we can, just before I let you go, talk about the American Worldview Inventory, because as people go to the Cultural Research Center for Arizona Christian, we have that link there immediately. Let me encourage our listeners, if they have not done so, even though we've encouraged them in previous conversations, to click on that so they can get the research alerts and those kinds of things. But the one that's being featured right now is, of course, the Moralistic Therapeutic Deism, Introducing America's Most Popular Worldview. And I think it brings us back to something that I would also say, in addition to going to your website, because in some respects, the things that you're talking about aren't just conversations you're having, but this is the kind of work that you are doing right now, and your president, who's been on the program with us at Arizona Christian University, is trying to do. Because if we don't teach it in our churches, if we don't teach it in our Christian schools, it's pretty clear that they're going to, that is, most people are going to adopt the worldview of the world, or a syncretistic worldview, and they're not going to be living out Christian lives. Fair?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would add to that parents have to remember that it's really not even the job of the schools to introduce their children to God's ways. That's the primary responsibility in life of every parent. And you can't subcontract that to other paid professionals. You really have to be doing that in the home, modeling it for your children, and very intentionally and strategically helping your children to understand biblical principles and to apply them. That's really where it's got to start.
And I might just suggest for those few parents right now, or grandparents, you might take some of the questions that George Barna has asked through this particular American Worldview Inventory, and ask them around the dinner table, see what kind of answers you get. Or maybe if you're a Sunday school teacher, just ask them around a few individuals and see what you get. And I think you'll be surprised, because if nothing else, the survey shows that some of these false ideas have a lot more currency in our culture than we'd like to believe. So, George Barna, it is always a delight to have you on the program. We do have the most recent survey results that is on pointofview.net. And, of course, we also have a very good link to your website, which is at the Cultural Research Center. So thank you for joining us on Point of View. And, as always, look forward to the next opportunity.
Me too. Thanks again, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and if nothing else, a very good reason why we're going to be doing what we're doing next hour. Mark Clark will be with us. Has a new book out. It is called The Problem of Jesus, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus. A good portion of it certainly will be great material for you to put into your toolbox, your evangelism toolbox, your apologetics toolbox, and know how to answer it. But then there's a good portion there as well that will encourage you, if you are a Bible-believing Christian, to understand a little bit more about what Jesus is calling for us to do. So I think you're going to enjoy the book, and we will have him on right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we do on Point of View is we want to help you be able to articulate a biblical worldview, but also know how to defend a biblical worldview, and that is, of course, the area of apologetics. And so we spend a fair amount of time really trying to give you some tools for your evangelism toolbox, some tools for your apologetics toolbox. And so when we come across various books or resources that will help you accomplish that, certainly that is the case. In the past, when we've had people like George Barna on the program, he's talked about how we certainly have a tremendous need to reach out to the skeptics and those individuals that maybe have very serious questions about Christianity. How can we answer some of those questions? And so we're going to be spending some time today talking with Mark Clark. He certainly should sound familiar to you because we've interviewed him and even replayed the interviews in his previous book, The Problem of God, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to Christianity. His new book out is one that is similar. It's called The Problem of Jesus, Answering a Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus. We're going to get into arguments for the existence of Jesus. Was he a historical figure? Evidence for the Gospels and a variety of other aspects. It will be helpful to you in terms of evangelism, but I think it will also challenge you, if you're already a Christian, to begin to think about what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. He is the founding pastor of the Village Church, a multi-site church that is up there in the area of Canada and resides in Vancouver, British Columbia. And once again, Mark, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me, sir. Good to be here.
And again, I might just mention that really your focus in your church has always been to try to reach skeptics and really even to challenge Christians. Can you give us a little bit of that? Because that's something that I know is part of your heart for ministry, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't grow up in the church at all. So when I was about 18, 19 years old, I started reading the Bible and met Jesus. And then some people started saying, hey, you should become a leader. You should become a preacher and a pastor. And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. That's not a good career choice. And so, through a series of events, I ended up doing that and going to school and got a passion for scholarship and the Bible. And so when we started the church 11 years ago in Vancouver, my heart was to reach people like me who'd grown up in, skeptical households, agnostic, atheist. Actually, my dad was, opposed to Christianity in so many ways. So I wanted to reach people like me. So I decided, okay, let's start a church where we preach verse by verse through the Bible. And we're constantly, so the Christian is being discipled. But then every week is evangelism too, because we're constantly talking about the skeptical issues that real people are dealing with in their life so that people's neighbors can show up. And if you speak to them enough and you show them the beauty of the gospel as the solution to all their questions and their issues and the things that they face in their life, you begin to realize that you can reach both non-Christians and Christians with the gospel, which is my passion. Get the Christians to be in awe of Jesus, but they get the person who doesn't believe yet to realize it's a legitimate belief and to follow him. And so that's the heart of the church that I started. And then, of course, it ends up being the heart of this book, too. So.
It certainly is. You know, and I used to spend a lot more time speaking on college campuses. Now I spend a lot of time doing radio, but I came to the conclusion early on that the kind of presentations I would do if I were at the University of British Columbia, for example, where you're located, or if I was at Oregon State or University of Washington or anywhere I might be, that the bottom line is that I would obviously try to very carefully explain Christian ideas without using Christianese. Then I came to realize when you're talking to the average Christian, they aren't necessarily that well schooled, so you really don't have to change your message there either, because there's such a need for people. And even if you have somebody that's a faithful follower there at Village Church, in their heart of hearts, they probably still have some doubts about some of these issues, like, was Jesus really historical? What about the gospel? What about miracles and those kinds of things? So you have 18 chapters broken into 9 different parts, and so we're going to try to see if we can work our way through some of those, because if nothing else, I think that will equip people to know how to respond. And the first one is pretty simple, and that is just the whole issue, did Jesus really exist? I don't run into that too often, sometimes on Facebook, but my quick answer to that is, look, you've got to understand that even secular historians, even people that would not be Orthodox Christians, say, no, Jesus existed. If you want to start with the idea that Jesus didn't exist, you are so far out of the mainstream, because in some respects we have so much evidence for the existence of Jesus, don't we?
Yeah. I mean, I read a few years ago, I read an 800-page book on the historical Jesus, and the author said, I'm gonna basically just give one sentence to the question of whether Jesus existed. He did, and anybody who questions it is like, it's relegated to a footnote, like the idea that he didn't exist. Caesar wouldn't be. We have more evidence that Jesus existed than Caesar and most of the historical people back in the time. And the reason we have that is not only from the Gospels themselves and the legitimacy of the Gospels, but we have scholars that were writing in the first century, totally antagonistic toward Christianity. Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger. You have about probably 10 people, historians, who are writing about first century politics and wars that mention Jesus by name. So they're not part of some myth. They're not saying, oh, let's create him, because there's the skeptics who talk about this are people who think the church made Jesus up and that he's just an archetype of some, God complex that the human psyche has. And just a group of people got together and said, let's make up Jesus. He's the new Horus or whatever. And outside of Christianity, you have all these first century historians naming Jesus and saying he existed. He was a miracle worker. He told parables. Actually, their main category for him was parabolist. He was a guy walking around telling stories. He was a rabbi, and they make these claims about him. They said, look, he really existed. So it's not really a question that legitimate historians have. It's more, there's kind of this mainstream, almost become mainstream, certainly in secular cultures like mine up here in Vancouver, where it's almost like a conspiracy theory that has gained traction where people actually believe it's true. And it's kind of not hard to prove that it's false.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into then what about the record, because we don't have anything that Jesus actually wrote, but we do have the eyewitness account. So what are the Gospels? Can we trust the Gospels? So we'll get into that. Then we're going to get into the whole issue of the problem of discipleship, because he was more than just a teacher, and what are the demands that Jesus makes on our life? The problem of loving God and the whole counterfeit gods. That whole chapter 7 is very similar to some of the conversations we had with people like George Barna. Then the problem of miracles and how that could even be another very significant argument. The problem of the stories of Jesus, the problem of Jesus as God or as God as Jesus, then the problem of the death of Jesus, and then, of course, the problem of the resurrection. We come back also, Mark, we might talk about the idea of the scandal of Jesus. I mentioned before you came on the air that a lot of that comes from the Greek word, but some people might say, well, your other book talked about just answering a skeptic's challenges. This one's answering a skeptic's challenges to the what? Scandal of Jesus. We'll talk about what that means and get into some other aspects of the book. It is published by Zondervan. I'm sure you can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link there as well on our website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Whether you are a Christian or not, you are benefiting from the positive impact of Christianity on your life. That's the premise of the book by Dr. Rodney Stark, America's Blessings, How Religion Benefits Everyone, Including Atheists. His book is a perfect response to atheistic professors who criticize America and the Christian foundation of this country. This book is a natural one for the professor to write since he has talked about the positive contribution of Christianity to Western civilization. Since we live in a country that Stark believes is unusually religious, we shouldn't be surprised that many of the blessings that Christianity has brought to the world can be found in America. He says people who attend church tend to donate more than others. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the research by Arthur Brooks that found the same things. Rodney Stark says that religious people dominate the ranks of blood donors, to whom even some angry humanists owe their lives. Christians also are far more likely to contribute even to secular charities, to volunteer their times for socially beneficial programs, and to be active in civic affairs. Religious Americans also enjoy better physical health. They have an average life expectancy more than 7 years longer than those of the irreligious. In fact, much of the difference remains even after the effects of clean living are removed. Rodney Stark also talks about another topic we've discussed in previous commentaries, the fertility gap. The fertility rate for religious people is much higher than for secular people. He cites Eric Kaufman's book, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? That book points out that when you look at Europe, the population is declining, except in the religious sector. Despite what you might hear from atheists and skeptics, Christianity has been a blessing to America and the world. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Mark Clark, and again, he is the founding pastor of the Village Church. You are already familiar perhaps with his book, The Problem of God. This one's The Problem of Jesus, answering the skeptics' challenges to the scandal of Jesus. Just real quickly, Mark, talk about this idea of scandal, because that I thought was another piece of insight that many people may not be aware of.
Yeah, I mean, multiple times in the Gospels and in the epistles, it talks about how people would stumble over Jesus or the cross or the gospel, and the Greek word for stumble is scandalon. And so you realize that there's a piece of the message of Jesus that is a stumbling stone for many people. It's something that if you're living a certain lifestyle, if you're an atheist, for instance, the concept of Jesus as God is going to be a scandal to what you already believe. If you're a Hindu and you believe there are millions of gods, the concept that Jesus is God is going to be a scandal to you. If you're an agnostic and you believe that if there's a God, he's unknowable, then Jesus coming and saying, I'm the only way to the Father, is going to be a scandal to you and your lifestyle and the way that you live and how you think and what you do. And so in that way, Jesus, everywhere he goes in modern culture or ancient, is and was a scandal that we have to lean into rather than away from. So that's how I'm using the word.
Let's, if we can, talk about the Gospels, because you'll have a lot of individuals that say, okay, maybe Jesus existed, but can I really trust the Gospels? And first of all, you need to know what they are. But I love the various criteria, or each one a criterion of apostolic apostolic authority, the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of discontinuity, of multiple attestations. In some respects, you're coming up with some very good arguments for why even a fair-minded individual who doesn't believe that the Bible is the Word of God has to at least say they actually fit some very important criteria.
Yeah, I mean, it's like most people who don't trust the Bible look at the Gospels and say they made them up. There's a group of people just making up Jesus, making up stories, making him look like a big, hero that everyone should follow. And, of course, the criterion of embarrassment, for instance, is that scholars actually look at the Gospels and they go, there's stuff about the Gospels that they keep in, that they include, that you never would have done in that time if you wanted these things to actually start making the rounds and for people to pass them around and actually believe them and look at Jesus as this great hero who was perfect, who knew everything. He was God. Just take out the story where someone walks up to him and says, hey, do you know when you're coming back? And he says, no, I have no clue. Only the Father knows. Or this week I was preaching on Mark 5. And of course in Mark 6, he says he goes into his own village and he could not do any miracles there. And it's like, what do you mean? I thought he was God. Why is he sitting in a garden crying and saying, I don't want to do this mission anymore. Can you please take it and send it to somebody else? Those are the things that you should delete. They're embarrassing things. They're things that if you want your gospel that you're making up to spread around, don't have those things in it. And yet scholars look and they go, the gospel writers kept these things in it. It actually makes it legitimate. It makes us look at the gospels and go, these are credible documents that are simply saying, look, we can't reconcile all this perfectly. This is just what happened. And it makes people actually, the Gospels are vindicated over and over and over again, whether that's archaeology or people looking into them and saying all those things. And it's also very interesting when we don't think about this very often, Kerby, the idea that, like, what about all the things that the early church could have put back into the mouth of Jesus to solve all of the problems of the early church? So when we read the letters, for instance, there's all kinds of issues with, hey, are women allowed to be pastors? What about tongues? What about, Gentiles getting circumcised? All of these massive problems that when you read the rest of the New Testament, they're trying to solve all these issues. Why didn't the gospel writers just put back into the mouth of Jesus, here's my stance on tongues. Here's what I think about circumcision. He doesn't say anything about any of the issues.
Yes.
And scholars look at that and go, you know what? They could have done it. They didn't do it. They're just reporting what he said.
And again, another aspect of that you talk about, and then we'll move on to the next, is the fact that the Gospels are contemporaneous, and that is they're not legends. It takes time for a legend to develop, and yet you have, shortly after the death and resurrection of Jesus, some of the original source material for the Gospels, and all of them written fairly early on. And so there's just no place for legend and later changes, even though that's an argument sometimes made. There's very good evidence against it. So those are the first couple of chapters. If you want to make another comment about that, it's great, but I also want to get into this whole idea of discipleship, because you take these ideas not only to challenge the skeptic, but then you use those to challenge Christians, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I think discipleship is kind of the fundamental question of our life, in a sense. Jesus was all about, obviously the Great Commission is making disciples, but the question is, are we disciples before we go on and try to make disciples of other people? Are we disciples? And so Jesus has this really core concept where he's the rabbi who's walking around and he's collecting these followers and he's teaching them a way of life. And he's literally saying to them, look, as you go on in life, I think it's 269 times the New Testament uses the word disciple, 3 times it uses the word Christian. So as Dallas Willard pointed out, the main paradigm for Christianity in the world is discipleship. But what does that mean? It's that we accept Jesus not only as Savior, but as Lord too. He gets to construct reality for us. How do we do sex? How do we do family? How do we do money? How do we live in the empires of the world that we live in? How do we live in the midst of temptation? He's all of those things too. And so I'd spend a couple chapters talking about this is the fundamental challenge of our life. We grow up in this world that says, Attach your heart to money, attach your heart to beauty, attach your heart to reputation and success in the world. This is how you're going to find meaning, purpose, value. And Jesus says, no. To come into my kingdom means that you have to come out of all the other kingdoms. And I want to shape your mind. I want to shape your heart. I want to shape your very life. That there's no version of Christianity, according to the Gospels, where, you and I have maybe a different Christology than our neighbor, where we might believe something different about Jesus, but then we do Netflix the same, we spend our money the same, we act. There's no version of Christianity where we look the exact same, but we just believe some different stuff. Discipleship throws all of that out and says, no, it's an entire praxis. It's a behavioral life that is alternative to the world that you're living in.
One of the things I love about your books is, only guy I know that 1 minute's quoting from Jordan Peterson, the next minute from Luke Skywalker or Katniss Everdeen or Malcolm Gladwell. But let's take that Malcolm Gladwell one, because I never thought about using this idea of the 10,000-hour rule to talk about discipleship, because in some respects, whether you see some of the most gifted violinists, some of the most gifted athletes, even for those of us that write books, let's face it, some of the first ones weren't quite as good as some of the later ones. And there is a sense in which you learn by doing, and there is a sense in which that 10,000 rule that Malcolm Gladwell talks about really applies to Christianity, doesn't it?
Yeah. So his thesis was basically, and he was taken from a bunch of researchers, but like you said, the violinists, the artists, the Beatles, Bill Gates, all these people, it's not just that they were born different. And that has been the thesis, like, oh, these guys were just born brilliant. Of course, nature is a part of it, but there's also this nurture piece where these people spent so many hours, and the psychologists came together and decided that number was somewhere in the 10,000-hour range, where to become a master at something, you had to have spent at least 10,000 hours doing that thing. And so I use that as, this point where I preached that one day, and then a woman came up to me after the service and said, if you actually look at the 3 years that Jesus spends with the disciples, if it's 8 hours a day, 5-6 days a week for 3.5 years, that's 10,000 hours. And I make the point, it's like he's trying to make them not to just, it wouldn't have taken anything for Jesus to walk down the mountain, hand them a book and say, here, just believe all this stuff. This is now Christianity. But he doesn't do that. He spends 3.5 years because he wants them to become masters of this thing. And then he says, okay, now your job's to go make masters out of other people at this thing in life, belonging, belief, practice, behavior, all of these things. And so it takes time. And so, grace doesn't, that's the thing that saves you, but grace isn't opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning salvation, but it's not opposed to the effort that it takes to say, hey, I actually believe in Jesus and want to follow him with my whole life. And that's the picture of the 10,000 hours.
Mark Clark with us. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. This is published by Zondervan. We have a link so that, first of all, I think you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, and I would encourage you to support your local bookstore. But if you can't find it or you don't have access to one, we have a link where you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. The Problem of Jesus, Answering the Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk with Mark Clark, the problem of Jesus, answering a skeptic's challenges to the scandal of Jesus. By the way, we haven't really opened up the phone, so if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or most importantly, I suspect many of you are just kind of taking some notes and learning, and maybe you know somebody who is a skeptic that might need some of these answers. Let me encourage you to go to the website, pointofview.net. You can click on that button that says listen and then send the podcast, or you can hit the watch button or even go to the YouTube channel and send it on. So there are just all sorts of ways in which you can use this for your own personal growth, but also maybe to begin to challenge some of your friends and neighbors, coworkers, even family members. And this is certainly a book I would want to put in your hands, and it's published by Zondervan, just came out. Let's, if we can, talk about the problem of loving God, and it really gets into one of your chapters on counterfeit gods, because what it is sort of relates to the kind of conversation we have oftentimes with George Barna. We have kind of this gospel of comfort, this gospel of moralistic, therapeutic deism. And in some respects, Jesus is calling for us to do a lot more than simply hold to a particular view or a particular worldview, obey a certain number of rules. It is really, in a sense, to really begin to love God with our heart, our soul, and our mind. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you picture, your house is on fire and you need to run out with your top things, you're going to go out with the things that rise to the top in regard to priority. And when somebody came to Jesus and said, "What's the most important thing?" his answer was, "Love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and strength." At the end of the day, this is what he said I would run out of a burning house with. This is the top thing. And, to be honest with you, I went to most of the books in my library and didn't find really a one that talked about what does it mean to love God with your whole life. And so I wrote these couple chapters to try to correct that and go, this is a massive priority. That Augustine said, we are what we love. And at the end of the day, our gut or our affections or our pleasure is really the reason we make the decisions we make. It actually overrules even our reason sometimes. So I did a lot of premarital counseling as a pastor, and I would have these couples sitting in front of me, and they're going to get married, and they don't get, all the data says they shouldn't get married. And I would look at them and say, look, you got nothing in common. This is going to be a disaster. And then they look at me and they say, yeah, but she's so cute. Or he's so hot. And it's like, oh no, your gut is even more powerful than your reason in this moment. And so the beautiful thing about Christianity is it's trying to pull our hearts off of the gods of the world where we find meaning. We love success. We love beauty. We love reputation. We love money. We love comfort, as you said. And so Jesus, when he's saying, I want you to love God with everything, he's not just doing it like, oh, God's a narcissist, he wants you to love him. It actually has this filtered down impact pragmatically on our life, which is the only way. Thomas Chalmers years ago wrote a sermon called The Expulsive Power of a New Affection. And what he talked about is we're always going to be addicted to something. The only way to actually stop being addicted to one thing is not just to run away from that one thing. It's to actually be addicted to something else that trumps that thing. And so I grew up smoking. It was really hard for me to stop smoking. Only when I fell in love with my wife and she didn't like smoking did I ever stop. So we need something that we love more that then gets that thing out of the way. And this is why Jesus is saying, listen, you're already in love with comfort. Luke chapter 9, let me go bury my father. No, you can't actually love your family more than me. You have to love me because that's going to be the best thing for your family. And so he has this super practical heart where he knows that when we love God with our heart above success and money and family and fame, that's going to mean our flourishing. And that's why he does it.
Wow. You know, one of the illustrations you give is how difficult it is to change behavior. And you use something from Super Freakonomics. Again, it's amazing you read some of the same kind of books I do. But the difficulty was, and I won't get into all the details, in a hospital, they were having difficulty with these doctors not washing hands. And you think, really, this is pretty pathetic. But nevertheless, let's just assume that the hand hygiene rate was low. And we'll leave it at that. We won't even identify which one of those medical centers it was. And so they're doing all sorts of kind of things to bring about change, gift cards, posters, emails. Nothing's working until they decide to get them one day out there during a lunch meeting to put their hand in agar and then culture their hand. And so then you get these images of these disgusting gobs of colonies of bacteria. And then they go one step further. They put those as screensavers on the computers. And it's kind of like everybody got their attention. And I think there's a sense in which that's the struggle you have, Mark, no doubt. Yeah. You give this great message at Village Church. Everybody walks out going, boy, that wasn't a great message. But nothing changes. And in some respects, discipleship should change behavior, right?
Yeah, and I think it's exactly that. And I think one of the things that we have wrong that I use that illustration for is what we tend to sometimes preach and think is that we're going to think our way into a certain state. And so if we can just read the right books or listen to the right podcasts or go to a marriage conference, that's going to solve us because we can take notes and we can figure it out, and all change happens from the head down. That's what we tend to think. But the reality is, and James K. Smith talks a lot about this super helpfully in his book, You Are What You Love, where he talks about it's actually habits that we create in our life that form our desires. And so to say to ourselves, well, I'm just going to think my way into discipleship. Notice Jesus said, no, I need you to actually not just think about, whether you love God. I need you to follow me and carry a cross. Because when you're doing certain habits, those habits over time start to form your very desires. And that's the thing we rarely talk about. And so, for instance, people who go running, when they start running, if they get up at 5 a.m, they hate it. For the first day, the first week, the first month, it feels terrible. But over time, your body starts to love the dopamine and actually starts to give you pleasure, and you become somebody who loves it. That habit actually formed what you want to do. And that's the beautiful thing about discipleship is it's not like religion. It's not like, hey, I want you to do all these rules. There's certain ways where we follow Jesus into the kingdom and our heart comes later. Right. And I think we've lost that piece.
The old fake it till you make it kind of thing, and force you to do it before you like it. Because if you wait for this real hunger to read God's word in your devotional life, or your real hunger to do evangelism, it may just never happen. But if you just say, look, this is what I'm supposed to do. Once I'm in the process of going and doing, I begin to like it as well. So just some great principles. Real quickly before we take a break, you have a section here on the stories of Jesus, and of course he was a master storyteller in parables, but what would you want us to maybe pick out of that? Because that's something that a lot of people, even non-believers, say, why did Jesus tell so many stories? What was that all about?
Right. Yeah, I think what he's doing is he's trying to appeal to our heart again, and rather than just come up and give us cognitive ideas, believe this about God, believe this about your life, believe this about salvation and heaven, he tells a story about a bird and seed and 2 brothers, because I think stories work on us to make it stick far more than prose do. And so he's trying to, the reason we love movies, the reason we look at the power of media, one of the things we're constantly talking about is make sure the media, doesn't hurt your kids. What is that? It's because we know the stories they tell have an impact on our worldview more than just somebody getting up on a news channel and say, hey, you should, kid, you should love $400 shoes. That's not going to get them to do it. You do a commercial where the shoes shine and the sparkle and the beauty. Jesus knows the power of stories because it frames our experience. It answers the massive questions. Who are we? Where are we? What's the problem? What's the solution? So he's doing these things in order to capture our imagination, because he knows if our imagination and heart can be captured, then we truly become, citizens of the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the world. So that's what I think his stories are trying to do.
Let's take a break. When we come back, Jesus as God or God as Jesus. There are a lot of people that say, Jesus was a great storyteller. Jesus was a great prophet. He encouraged us to be moral. No, Jesus made some pretty incredible claims, and we're going to talk about what he said, what he did, and most importantly, why we should believe in him. And so, again, you're going to have some great material that you can use as you are maybe sharing the gospel or answering questions from your friends, neighbors, co-workers, family members, and if nothing else, that's why I commend to you this book, The Problem of Jesus, Answering the Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus. Mark Clark will continue with us right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Mark Clark with us as we talk about the book, The Problem of Jesus, Answering the Skeptic's Challenges to the Scandal of Jesus. And Mark, we had somebody off air who obviously didn't hear the first part of the program, which is fine because people can tune in and all tune out at different times. And they said, what's this scandal of the Jesus stuff? And again, I thought this was very helpful because early on you explained that when it talks about in Matthew 13, the scribes, Pharisees, and others others took offense, but the actual Greek word is scandalon. Or you can go to the Gospel of John, for example, John 6, and it says, does this, and again, offend you, or really scandalizo was the word. So there is a sense in which Jesus, because he makes such incredible claims, was a scandal, if you will, to the unbeliever and a challenge even for the believer. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly what he's doing, because he's challenging. I mean, if you're a first century Jew living at the time of Jesus, which Jesus, of course, was, he wasn't a 21st century, Canadian or American. He's walking in and he's telling stories about the kingdom of God coming and how he's the center of that. You can see their reaction. Most of them don't believe, because they're like, this doesn't fit our narrative. This doesn't fit our expectations. And so when he comes in with his message, it's like a bomb going off in that culture, and there's a scandal to it, which is why most of them reject it and say, we can't do this and we got to walk away from it. We pitch Jesus as, he's just saying nice things. He's giving pithy little sayings and teachings and walking around being a nice guy. And it's like, nobody kills that guy as a revolutionary. They kill somebody who's so scandalous that half the people think he's a heretic, that he's a blasphemer. He doesn't fit their categories at all. So that's the idea of the scandal. It's funny. There's a commercial for the book on Facebook, and I go check in on it every once in a while just to see the comments. And what people hone in on is my title,
yes,
The Problem of Jesus. And it's very funny because you can tell none of them actually watched the video. None of them have read the book, of course, because they just hone in on a word, the problem. And they go, Jesus isn't the problem. This guy is the problem, and you're like, do you even know what the word problem means? It's an intricate question to be figured out. It's in math, we talk about a math problem. And people zone in on certain words and they just draw the wrong conclusion. You're like, I'm just talking about a guy who needs to be solved. What his message, you got to figure it out for yourself. Every person is going to stand before God in judgment one day. And the only question on the table is going to be, what did you do with my son? So, of course, that's the main intricate question that we need to figure out in our life. So that's, of course, what I mean. So anyway, so that's what the scandal piece is about.
Well, and it's a good setup for chapter 13 because there's a whole section here, what he said, what he did. I mean, just think of you are a Jew in a Unitarian society, and here Jesus claims to be equal with God, John 5. Yeah. I am the way, I and my Father are one, John 10. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but through me, John 14:6. I mean, just think of how all the things that Jesus said, and then all the facts that then he also asked people to pray to him, to actually end in their prayer to him. They are, in some respects, to follow him. They are not to be called rabbis because he is the leader, and on and on and on. You just go through this long list. You got pages and pages, which I think illustrate only so well how radical the claims of Jesus were. And so then to have somebody say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. Well, why did they pick up stones every time we turned around and want to stone him? If he didn't claim to be God, well, you go for it.
Yeah, I think that mistake comes because we're Westerners who we're looking for Jesus to claim to be God in the way that we would. And the problem with that, like we're looking for the verse that says, I am God in those three words. But for him to have done that, we can't miss the fact that, okay, so let's say he did that. Let's say he said the words, I am God. Just as straight as that. Now take that concept and go to India and talk to Hindus and go, Jesus claimed to be God. Well, great. There's 300 million gods. You're God, I'm God, that thing's God. There's a pantheon of gods. That's not a big deal.
Yes.
So what we forget is Jesus claimed to be God in a very specific way. He claimed to be Israel's God, the monotheistic God who was one God who made the world. He claims something very specific, so he did it in a way that culture understood, and we might not. So the kind of list that you're talking about claims to forgive sin, claims to be the presence of God, claims to be the new temple, claims to, people can pray to him. I and the Father are one. All of these huge, I am that I am. I was before Abraham. All these things where the people, like you just said, John 5 and other places, they go, oh my goodness, he's making himself equal with God let's stone him, let's kill him. He was doing it in a way that they understood and very clearly understood, and that we sometimes miss. The early church worshiped him as God, sang to him, prayed to him, very clearly said this was an incarnation of God himself. 20 years after his death and resurrection, they're writing that in letters. Very clear the early church believed that.
Just for running out of time here, I just thought we might have you talk a little bit about how people can use this. Obviously, this is great for self-study, but the way you've put it together, I know that we have pastors, Sunday school leaders, small group leaders, and others that might want to take these 18 chapters broken into 9 sections. I mean, that's kind of like a 9-week series or an 18-week series, however you want to do it. And you've put this together in a way to use this in a way that, number one, would challenge non-believers would be willing to get together and talk about a book study, but also something that will challenge Christians to go deeper into their Christian life.
Yeah, and there's also Zondervan just in the last week or two has just released a video series. So I did a video series for this book as well that has a study guide. So people can watch me teaching on the material in the book in like a small group setting maybe, and it's got 9 sessions or about 45 minutes each, and then a study guide. It's probably 100 pages long, and it really pulls out the teachings and then says, hey, fill in the blanks. You can ask these questions in small groups. So that might be a good way to do it too. But that's the hope, is that people are, the way I use books like this is like, hey, my buddy who's a non-Christian, he doesn't believe in any of this. Here's what I'm asking you to do. I buy you a book, read a chapter a week, or let's go meet for coffee and let's chat about it. What did it say to you? Let's debate it. Let's make fun of it. Let's be critical. That's how I use this book, and I hope that other people will. So
it's very, very good. Well, the earlier book, The Problem of God, this one's The Problem of Jesus. Do we have a sequel coming up as well?
Yeah, I'm talking about, I have an idea, and I think what it might be, I don't have a title for it yet, but if I'm going to round off the trilogy, it's something around the problem of us. And what I mean by that is like the human, the longing of the human soul.
Oh, good.
What is that about? And how is Christianity the answer to ultimately the human experience? So I think it's something along those lines.
Well, we need to get you on a little more regularly. Don't be a stranger. And if nothing else, we certainly have appreciated the great work that you've done in these 2 books. And certainly, I've said before, next time I get up there to Vancouver, BC, I'm going to come to the Village Church and sit in the back and watch it, because I certainly appreciate the work that you're doing there.
Awesome, Kirby. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you for giving us an hour today. And if nothing else, let me encourage all of our listeners as we say goodbye to Mark that indeed this is a book that I think you'll find very helpful. I know from time to time as I travel around, and next week I think I'm in Georgia and South Carolina for a little bit, I always have people saying, do you have a book you might recommend to my unsaved neighbor, friend, family member, whatever? Certainly I tend to talk about Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, and a variety of others, but some of these books are really written to really challenge the skeptic, and this is another one in that series. So I hope you appreciated the conversation with Mark Clark, and certainly we had a conversation today with George Barna. We have a lot more to cover tomorrow, but that will be tomorrow. First of all, I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.